Listen to that douchebag.
Hi everyone, it's skoosc here to Let's Play and critique the original Bioshock. Bioshock is one of the most critically acclaimed games ever made. If you look at the scores on Metacritic, it's sitting at a very respectable 96%. That puts it in equal first place in the all-time PC rankings with Half-Life 1 and 2 and the Orange Box. And it puts it in second place on the all-time Xbox 360 rankings, behind Grand Theft Auto 4 and equal with Orange Box, Mass Effect 2 and Skyrim. It's generally accepted among the unwashed gamer masses as being one of the best games ever made. As the Games by PC review states, Bioshock is a triumph, an absolute masterpiece that needs to be played by anyone with the slightest interest in gaming. It's a high watermark, not just for the FPS genre, but for the hobby in general. 10 out of 10. I'm sorry Games by a PC review, but I wish to object on all counts. Bioshock is not a triumph, or an absolute masterpiece, or a high watermark for the FPS genre, or gaming in general. Bioshock is a flawed game that should not have been as well received as it was. Its commercial and critical success has been a negative influence on the AAA industry. Let's go back, so I can show you why. The game begins by introducing us to silent protagonist Jack on a plane trip over the mid-Atlantic. Jack claims that he was destined to do great things, which is somewhat foreboding given that he's about to murder a heap of people in a plane crash, before spending the next several hours assaulting people with a pipe wrench. Following a cut to the game title, we're left underwater, watching plane debris sink around us. Bioshock is a cinematic game. Cinematic games like to tell stories. Unfortunately, they do this through an unhealthy reliance on film techniques, much to the detriment of the game's mechanics. For example, in this sequence, control is taken away from the player, so the game can move and look around for you, and show you the plane wreckage sinking in a cinematic way. We don't let the player control the camera, because they'll just fuck up the lovely shots by trying to play the game. So we keep it out of their control, to really give the player a good understanding that a plane crash is dangerous. The game brings Jack to the surface, so it can set up a nice cinematic shot of the game's particle effect engine. In 2007, when Bioshock first came out, no other game looked this good. If you were a graphics enthusiast, you'd be trying to hide an erection right now. Even if you're a lady, or trying to hide your lady erection. And if you're a video game reviewer, you'd have just moved your score to at least an 8 out of 10, which is the standard minimum score for games with cutting edge graphics. At this point we're finally given control of the camera and movement, so to demonstrate some more of the problems with cinematic games, I decided to swim Jack into some fire. Here's another problem with jamming your game full of set pieces to make it look pretty. The fire doesn't actually hurt you. What the fuck is the point of having fire in a video game that the player can touch no less if it can't hurt you? I mean, they even went so far as to make the screen flash and make Jack cry out in pain, but they didn't bother to have it affect your health. This entire plane crash sequence is void of any meaningful gameplay. It's all for show. The player is made a spectator, or a movie watcher, instead of a player. Although I suspect the reason the fire doesn't hurt you is because there's no Vita chambers at this point in the game. I'll discuss more of the unfortunate impacts of the Vita chambers later. Let's start discussing level design, since I'm going to be bringing it up a lot. Because Bioshock is a cinematic game, the levels have been designed less to be a play space to explore the mechanics, and more to be a backdrop to the game's other cinematic elements. So the first structure the player can see in the game is the lighthouse, by itself out here in the middle of the ocean. It's a single, ominous, intimidating structure, a black obelisk casting a haunting light out over the ocean, warning weary travellers away from the horrors that lie beneath. From a cinematic point of view, it's a simple and effective design, but let's consider it in terms of world building, believability, and immersion. Bioshock wants to immerse you into the world of Rapture. It's obvious from the flavour text in the load screens and the audio logs that a considerable amount of effort has been put into fleshing out a deep, believable world. With that in mind, look at the lighthouse. entrance to the great underwater city of Rapture, and ask yourself, how do people normally get to Rapture? I'm going to assume that Jack's case is an exception and that people don't normally arrive by plane crash, but if you look at the lighthouse, it's the only option that makes sense. There's nowhere for boats to be moored. They'd have to drop anchor over the city itself and move people to the lighthouse via rowboat. I have no doubt that the lighthouse looks cool, but imagine you're one of the poor bastards who had to deliver a piano to the Rapture Opera House. It's going to be a struggle just getting the damn thing off the boat to the lighthouse door. There's no room to unload things. There's no cranes or machinery to assist in unloading. There's nothing that would allow a boat to get close to the lighthouse without getting damaged on the rocks. And you'd have to carry it up so many stairs. Rapture is not wheelchair accessible, although given that it's full of objectivists, I'm going to assume that it was intentionally designed that way. So your ultra cool, intimidating lighthouse won't even allow people to get to the city unless by swimming or by plane crash. Funnily enough, the lighthouse at the beginning of Bioshock Infinite did have a place for boats to dock, because in that game Booker arrives by boat. And here's yet another cinematic technique on display. If you look over here, you can see the shadow on the clouds, like it's a backdrop on a movie set. As we enter the lighthouse, there's another cinematic trick a lot of games use. Doorways and linear corridors can be used to focus the player's camera. The player usually looks where they're going when they enter a door or walk down a corridor, which you can use to focus their attention on something in front of them. This technique isn't so bad, unless it's overused. If you overuse this technique, then your level will turn into a simple linear path that takes the player from set piece to set piece. The interior of the lighthouse is set up so the player can contrast the idealistic vision of Rapture to the reality of Rapture. Everything here is clean and gleaming. There's some nice, pretty architecture to see. And there's some pleasant music playing in the background. It's the exact polar opposite of Rapture itself. And we're introduced to the founder of Rapture, Andrew Ryan, which, if you're clever, you may realise is a rather clever and subtle bit of wordplay. It's actually an anagram of Wanna Dryer, which itself is a clever and subtle commentary on the metaphor of life itself. For aren't we all just people who will reject our social dues and build an underwater city, only to find ourselves in want of a dryer? Man, that's deep. Now we get into the spherical underwater elevator, and like most elevators in video games, it's used as a chance to deliver some dialogue, while the player isn't distracted by any gameplay, and they have nowhere to go and nothing else of interest to do or to look at. And while we're on the subject of dialogue, let's talk about Ryan's monologue. Bioshock wants to say something about objectivism, and game reviewers know that games that talk about serious issues and philosophy are important and legitimate works of art, even if the rest of the game is spent frisking down ashtrays for shotgun shells and murdering meth addicts. At the conclusion of the monologue, a game reviewer has probably moved their score to at least 10 out of 10, and put the game up for considering when it comes time to decide the game of the year. I don't think Bioshock made a very good commentary on objectivism. There are narrative and level elements that appear to support a clear anti-objectivist position, which is the correct position to take on matters regarding objectivism. But then there are elements that just make a mess of any message trying to be conveyed. Consider this. One of the main aspects of objectivism is an economic system based on laissez-faire free market capitalism, which relies on fierce competition to keep the market from falling under the control of a single firm. Now look at Rapture. It's a city that's entirely owned by one person. A person who also holds a monopoly on transport in and out of the city, and is the person in control of the security systems and the air supply in an underwater city. Can you really have an honest critique of objectivism when the environment you create is one that even objectivists would say is doomed to fail? Upon arriving in Rapture, we're treated to a murder firsthand, and since we're still stuck in the sensory deprivation sphere, with nothing else to look at, I guess we'll watch. So to establish a sense of place, that is, that rapture is dangerous and unwelcoming, we need to see this guy getting murdered, even though it doesn't make any sense. Atlas sent this guy to meet whoever had arrived in the bathysphere, and for some reason that's never explained, he was sent here unarmed, through a city that's crawling with splicers. What was he going to do if you were a threat from the outside? Heck, what was he going to do if you weren't? In addition to being unarmed, he has nothing to help you. His only purpose is to be a murder victim. The spider splicer seems to take offense to our presence. Rather than trying to work its way through the window or the door to murder us, like a splicer would probably do, it instead sticks to the script and disables the bathysphere instead. Then, rather than wait for a few seconds for us to leave the bathysphere, it jumps onto the ceiling and opens the window shutters to let some more light in.
I don't know how you survived that plane crash, but I've never been one to question Providence. I'm Atlas, and I aim to keep you alive. Now keep on moving. We're gonna have to get you to higher ground.
What good is higher ground when you're stuck indoors and your enemy can climb on the ceiling? So because there's a few scripted sequences that we need to show in order to continue with establishing a sense of place, this section has been made linear. It's also linear because we don't want to confront the player with too many difficult obstacles, like intersections and branching pathways. You can see the placards from people asking to be let out after Ryan deactivated the bathyspheres. Don't know why you'd bother going up there. It's just a lighthouse. It's not like there's any boats or anything. As we enter the departure lounge, the doorway frames our visions of the TV shorting out, and then the rubble on the floor with the baggage holder and the light at the far end of the room direct our attention to another minor set piece of Atlas using a security bot to fight off the spider splicer, which is something he never does again at any point in the game. The game then helpfully informs the player how to navigate over knee-high obstacles.
Now, would you kindly find a crowbar or something? Bloody splicer, seal Johnny.
And now we pick up our first weapon, the wrench. As you can see, we can't continue without the wrench because there's this rubble blocking the only path out of here. Hang on. How'd that guy that Atlas sent get through here, if there's rubble in the way? And here we have our first enemy that we're allowed to fight. It's a splicer, who first attacks us with a burning couch, before attempting to brain us with a metal pipe. Although, as you can see, he's not a very good shot with the metal pipe. His chances of braining us with it are very slim. But there's a very good explanation for all that. If you look carefully at the splicer, you can see that one of his eyes has been heavily damaged. So he's probably got a problem with depth perception. I don't think that's very good enemy design. Why make an enemy with shitty depth perception? Did they really think this was a good design? Like, they decided Adam should be physically destructive, and so the artist bakes up this guy, and then turns to the AI programmer and says, "Oh, I just textured that splicer, and one of his eyes is damaged. So, maybe tone down the effectiveness of the AI, so it misses every so often. You know, for the sake of realism." Killing the splicer causes a poltergeist to attack a pile of rubble on the stairs, to give us access to our first garden. Why? The game doesn't want you to access the plasmids before you've killed the splicer, because they've got a nice long cutscene to play after you pick it up. See, adding too many scripted sequences and cutscenes causes problems like this. You need to add more scripts and restrictions to make sure the player does exactly what you need them to do. And occasionally, you need to have a poltergeist remove an obstacle, because it's the only thing that makes sense. Now, let's just take a moment to recount what's happened so far. Not more than 10 minutes ago, Jack was the sole survivor of a plane crash. He then enters an underwater sea that's located in the middle of the ocean, filled with murderous genetically modified people. Instead of wondering if maybe he swallowed a bit too much seawater or took a hit to the head during the plane crash, he just rolls with it. Maybe a sense of judgment has been impaired from inhaling too many fumes with that fire. The sole friendly voice in the sea tells him that these people are called splicers, and they're violent and addicted to Adam. He then confronts one of these splicers, who attacks him with a burning couch, then a metal pipe, and continues to attack him until Jack brains him with a wrench. And he witnesses a poltergeist moving some furniture. So at this point, Jack knows that splicing is addictive, and everyone he's seen who has been spliced so far is mentally deranged, physically deformed, and either a murderer or attempted murderer. And then, in a sea that's apparently crawling with these splices, that are all addicted to Adam and plasmids, he finds a plasmid sitting out in the open for anyone to take. And he decides to splice himself with it. Yes, Jack, this is a superb idea. I'm sure it's perfectly safe. Nothing bad can come from this. Just go whole hog and inject the whole dose straight into your wrist. Well, because this is a game being sold to mainstream Western consumers, it needs to have a strong anti-drug message. And so Jack instantly loses control and we're treated to another cutscene. Oh, and now Atlas warned you that jamming syringes you found lying around in a city full of junkies is possibly a bad idea, and that caution is advised. Right before Jack falls over a barrel, he is knocked unconscious. So while Jack is too unconscious to move, but conscious enough to be aware of his surroundings, two splicers show up. And unlike every single other splicer for the rest of the game, they decide that for some reason they're not going to attack you. Then they run away, while taunting that a Big Daddy will be the death of you.
Yellow always have been. You'll be no better off with a metal daddy, little fish. See you floating, right?
And then the Big Daddy shows up, and also doesn't attack you. I guess it's good to know that while living people will be murdered on sight, unconscious people are considered off limits. When control is returned to you, Atlas decides to ask if you're okay. So, we know that Atlas is actually Fontaine, and we know Jack is an assassin that's been carefully engineered to be brought back to Rapture in order to assassinate Ryan. It's a plan that's been years in the making. All of Fontaine's eggs are in one basket. Jack is the most important thing in Fontaine's plans to take over Rapture, and yet, he just sat on his radio while you had not one, but two close encounters with Rapture's murderous denizens caused by you self-injecting a plasmid. Fontaine very nearly had his entire plan ruined, and he could have avoided it all just by advising Jack to maybe sit down before altering his DNA so he could shoot lightning. Incidentally, how did those splicers and Big Daddy even get into this room? It's completely sealed in. I'll end this video here, although I've still got plenty more to talk about. Hopefully next time there'll be some gameplay to critique. Well, until then, welcome to Rapture, everybody.